So, as we've been putting out a series of educational assets about the link between breast cancer and prostate cancer and understanding how genetic mutations can be inherited across families, we've seen incredible engagement from our community. And I think it's because it's put in the simple terms that our audience might not have seen before. And so we're used to thinking about the risk of our daughters if we have breast cancer or our sons if we have prostate cancer. But to think across genders and that if you have breast cancer, your sons may be at an increased risk of prostate cancer and other cancers and vice versa isn't necessarily as ingrained or even talked about. And so, Michael, this is something that you experienced when your older sister was diagnosed with breast cancer, and genetic testing revealed that she had a BRCA genetic mutation. So, can you talk to us about what was recommended to your family at that time?
Yes. Hi. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to share my experiences, and I hope it will be helpful to all the people who view this. Uh, my older sister, Laura, was diagnosed with breast cancer when she was 40 years old. And at that time, they weren't doing regular genetic testing. And she got into a program that required genetic testing that was a stem cell replacement program, I think is the way they described it back then. And during that process, she found out that she had this BRCA mutation, which was the first time any of our family had heard about it. My aunt, my father's sister, also died of breast cancer about 30 years earlier, but there was no genetic testing that we were aware of then. But the cancer was very similar. Uh, then, when my sister found out she had the BRCA mutation, there was no available insurance coverage for it for siblings or family members to do. I have three older sisters, the one who had cancer who since passed away, and two living older sisters. They paid out of pocket to have the testing done when it was available and found out that they did not have the BRCA mutation. At that time, no one had ever suggested it to me to say, Michael, you should get tested also. And it was several years later that Angelina Jolie came out in public and said she had a preventative um, double mastectomy and hysterectomy because she found out she had the BRCA mutation. And when that happened, insurance covered it. So my nurse practitioner said, "Why don't you get tested? It's a simple test." And it turned out that I had the BRCA mutation. And the genetic test was very strange. And the way your introduction presented it was really sort of clear to me that my genetic test report looked exactly like my sister's genetic test report. So there was no, the line that they show it on the report was exactly the same. We had the same exact mutation. You could have just changed the names and the date of the test. Um, the test itself didn't really provide me any other information, just the knowledge that I had it, because there wasn't a lot of information that men could or what the effects that men had from the BRCA mutation. They just said that I have a higher chance than other men to get prostate cancer, to get pancreatic cancer, and to get breast cancer, male breast cancer. So I'm a very healthy person. Fortunately, I don't have any ailments or don't take any medications at all. I never really have. And then in 2015, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer. I don't know if you want me to continue or just talk about the question you asked me.
Yeah, yeah. So we'll jump into that part. And so I want to bring Dr. Curry in to kind of add on kind of like what to expect with genetic testing as a genetic counselor and like what that process looks like, and kind of ground us on how genes are passed, and BRCA mutations make you at an increased risk, because we're hearing that it's important to know about your family health history, and let's say you do have a positive genetic mutation, how far reaching does that mean, for a family lineage? So can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. And thank you for having me here today. It's a privilege. And I always enjoy the opportunity to talk with people and hear their stories and think about what we can learn. And Michael, thank you for sharing that. I know it's always hard to talk about those things, but it helps so much. And thank you. So I think when we sort of think about genetics in general, sometimes it can seem like a hard topic or kind of an obscure topic. So I always try to be as sort of simple about it as I can. I kind of think about things simply myself, and so I try to convey that. I think about genes as the blueprints that our body uses to build our body, to build the proteins that make up the structure of our body. And our genes are inherited from our parents. They're inherited at the time when we are just one cell, when the egg and the sperm come together. We get all the genes from our parents that we're ever going to get. And we get a full set from our mother and a full set from our father. And then we have all of those that go together to make us ourselves. And those genes are packaged into chromosomes. We each have 46 chromosomes in total. And so then we have regular chromosomes, and then we also have the sex chromosomes X and Y. But most of our chromosomes are not things that get inherited differently from men and women. They are things that both men and women share. So all of the cancer genes that we know about and that people inherit are on genes that men and women share and inherit equally. So the way this works is that you could inherit a gene, for example, BRCA2, as we heard talked about, you would inherit a gene from both parents. You'd inherit one copy of BRCA2 from your dad and one from your mom. And it might be that there would be a change or mutation in the one from your dad, but not the one from your mom, and vice versa. And the way this works is it only takes one copy with a harmful change to put you at risk of getting cancer. So that's kind of how we think about it, is it only takes one to put you at risk. But it's not a certainty that you would get cancer. And typically, a person wouldn't get cancer unless they lose the other good copy from the other parent. So that's kind of how it works. And people will often say, what do these genes do? Probably the best way to describe what they do is that they repair damage to DNA. So when our cells divide, they have to replicate their DNA or their genes to have a new blueprint for the next cell. And there's a certain error rate, just because nothing is perfect, right? There's always a chance of a mistake. But we have other proteins in the cell and genes that come in to fix the errors. So we think of them as the spell checkers. I think of BRCA1 and BRCA2 as the spell checker genes. If you lose your spell checker gene, you could imagine that you might start to have a lot of errors in your DNA. And that's what cancer is it's an accumulation of lots of errors. And when you lose the function of the spell checker, it gets more so and can grow into a tumor. So I'm going to stop here and take a break because I think I said a lot of dense things, but I hope that began to talk a little bit about genes and risk.
I love that spell check analogy. That puts it in very simple terms. And so I've never heard that before, but I love that. And so I want to bring our final panelist in, Lauren. Um, and so Lauren, you were diagnosed with breast cancer at the age of 38, and your breast surgeon was the first person to ask you anything about genetics. And so I'm wondering, why did she want to have you tested? I know that many people are, intimidated by the idea of genetic testing. So could you share a little bit about what that experience was like for you, just so others could know kind of what to expect?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. I'm honored to share my story. So I was diagnosed technically 3 days before my 38th birthday. I used the years because I want the extra days in my life. So I was diagnosed at 37. And I went to my surgeon, and she was the first doctor that I saw. And she asks me some family history. And one of the questions she asked me was, are you of Ashkenazi Jewish descent? I was raised Jewish. I didn't know what Ashkenazi meant. So I immediately text my mom, and she says, yes, we are Ashkenazis. So that put me at higher risk of carrying BRCA. So my surgeon did a simple blood draw. It was super fast, very easy, and sent it off for testing. A few weeks later, she confirmed that I carried BRCA2. And the reason why she really needed to get this for my particular cancer was because if I was positive, which I was, it really determined the type of treatment I was going to get, as well as the type of surgery I would need to have, as well as any preventative surgeries or scans that would then, reduce my chances of reoccurrence, but also reduce my chances of other cancers from forming. So it was really important to understand that if I carried this gene in order to set me up for what was to come for my future.
Thank you for sharing. And Dr. Carrion, do you have anything to add to that about that genetic testing process?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Lauren. And again, I'm really impressed always with people who are willing to share their stories because it's not easy and it really helps people. So thank you. And I think, a lot of the things that you said are very striking to me. And I'll just say my job is to talk to patients who are going through these things. And so I've had the privilege of learning some of this. But I think, again, often people don't know, right? Like, why would you think about this unless you had to? Sometimes people have had an experience growing up of a family history. And Michael actually talked a little bit more about that, right? Of seeing these people in the family have these things happen to them. And you sort of sometimes have more of a sense of, oh, yeah, this applies to me and it might be an issue for me someday. Other times it might come out of the blue, like maybe a little bit more like it sounded like for you, Lauren, of, no one had talked about this before, because why would they, right? And so it kind of comes to people in different ways. I think part of our job as doctors, as the medical community, is to think about, all right, what do people need to know in advance? And when that might this be relevant for them to get genetic testing for themselves or for family, and how might that be used? And so one thing that sometimes comes up is the importance of family history. Why do you need to know your family history? I think Michael's story illustrated that better than anything I could say, right? That clearly there were these patterns in the family, and it came down to the same result on the genetic test because they shared exactly the same gene with exactly the same change in it, right? And that was something that they had both gotten from a parent. And that's why it matters. That I sometimes jokes that sometimes we might not like our relatives, but we can't get rid of them, right? That we have we share some of the same genes and that we're connected. And so it's important to know if someone might have had a cancer risk that could pertain to us. And so knowing that family history, if you can, is always power. Knowledge is power. I think in terms of the testing, sometimes it can happen in the setting like that of a family history where someone has already been tested, and then we can use that knowledge to test an unaffected relative, someone who doesn't have cancer. Other times, it may be that you're the first person in the family who unfortunately gets a diagnosis, and you then can get that blood test to find out. And then that becomes a tool for the rest of the family. And I always say it's actually a gift. And sometimes it doesn't feel like a gift. It doesn't feel like a gift to have to tell your relatives, hey, guess what? Not only do I have cancer, but this might be a risk to you too, right? That's a hell of a lot of a thing to have to do when you've just been diagnosed. But ultimately, it is a gift because just like you were saying, Lauren, it can help to think about not only what treatment you would get, but what kind of screening and prevention you could get and what kind of screening and prevention your relatives could get.
And so that's kind of a great segue into where I was going to go next with that is, after you all, Michael and Lauren, you get that positive genetic test result back. Then what? Like, what does that look like for you and, the rest of your family members? Was genetic testing a thing that was recommended and something that happened? Like, what did those next steps look like?
Well, one of the interesting parts about my family's genetic testing was that when my sisters, the two sisters that do not have the genetic mutation, that for their ability to pass it on to their children is blocked. They can't. It won't go skip a generation. It won't. BRCA specifically doesn't skip a generation. So their children couldn't have gotten it from my sisters. So that was a very interesting thing about the genetic mutation BRCA. And I also agree with Dr. Kurian that BRCA is a miracle discovery because genetics was not really used in terms of like proactive treatment in to my knowledge at all. And BRCA sort of enlightened the world. Now I believe the test that I just took was 180 different markers, and I only have on these were cancer predispositions. I only have the BRCA. So that was a relief because I already knew I had the BRCA, so it wasn't new news. And the one thing that is interesting about what Lauren said is that I also took a ancestry.com genetic test, and my genetic test came back with one line. I am 100% Central European Jewish blood. So I guess the marker is something like four generations of people behind me had to have 100% the same bloodline to get to me to have 100% the bloodline. So what my wife had like 19 different things that she was part this and part that. So that is an interesting uh, genetic factoid.
Yeah, and just I guess for my experience as well, so we had no family history. I was the first in my family to be diagnosed with breast cancer, and when I was diagnosed, my surgeon, advised me your family needs to get tested, and because my mother um, that's where the Ashkenazi Jewish descent came from. She was the first that we tested, and she was ultimately the carrier, followed by my sister, who does not carry the gene. And then from there, it was my grandmother who was tested. My grandfather has since passed. My grandfather carried the gene. My grandmother did not. So my mom got the mutation from my grandfather. And then from there, my mom's two brothers were tested. One tested positive, one tested negative. From there, their children or the uncle who tested positive, his two children will get tested. They've been advised at the age of 25. They're under 25 at this point. So in my experience, because the goal of my family was to get me healthy first. Then for them, the goal was to take preventative measures. So my mom had a preventative double mastectomy, as well as preventative hysterectomy. And then my uncle, who is in his 50s, is now on screening for prostate cancer as well as breast cancer. And then I also had a preventative hysterectomy about a year ago to prevent ovarian cancer. So I guess to just kind of go back to answering your question a little bit too, the conversation, like I said, was very much get me healthy first. That was the goal of my family. And then from there, I think everyone felt really empowered to take ownership of their health and to have the tools back pocket to know what they needed to do to get screened on a regular basis. Because had we known, I would have been screened years and years ago, and I wasn't because we didn't know. So my uncle always tells me, you're my hero. Like, you have given me so many things that I didn't know I needed to take care of for myself, but then also for my two daughters as well. We have had extended family who I don't even know. Also get genetic testing, also finding out that they're positive, and also having preventative measures taken. So if you have the tools, use them. They're of huge value to you, is the way I see it.
Just note my son was positive for the BRCA. My daughter was not, but I adopted her, so she was not my biological daughter. So the saga continues, or the miracle continues, like you said, because we're supposed to look for screenings for him when he turns 35 or something like that. And I qualify for pancreatic cancer screening since my father passed away from pancreatic cancer in October of 2023. He was the carrier in my family. My mother coincidentally had ovarian cancer in her 70s, but was not a BRCA genetic um, mutation carrier. So, but
Uh,
I get to do testing and MRI and blood work every 6 months if I want. But I'm very healthy, so I go 10 months or 11 months before I do because I feel weird searching.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you both for sharing that. I thought those were both amazing stories and brought up some really important things about the fact that, again, this is a gift to family members, as we were saying, and you are saving lives by sharing this information, right? And so probably the first life it saves would be your own, right? For many reasons in terms of talking about the treatment, the fact that we now have drugs that specifically target BRCA1 and 2 mutations, which are just amazing. I've been in the field for 2 decades, and seeing that happen was such a joy and really a miracle, right? And so really can save lives from breast and prostate and other cancers, pancreatic as well sometimes. So I think that's huge. And I think, one thing that I just wanted to bring out that I thought was interesting is there are a lot of uncertainties, right? So with these gene mutations, if a person has it, the chance that a first degree relative, which would mean a parent or a sister or a child, you kind of just take one branch on the family tree, right? The next relation to you has a 50-50 chance of sharing the gene mutation if they're a blood relation. So like Michael's adopted daughter would not share that gene with him, but that a blood relation, so a 50-50 chance. And so that kind of makes sense when you think about it in terms of what Lauren was saying about some people have it, some people don't. And so, sometimes you'll even see a family where like all 4 kids have it. And of course, that's very unfair, but we know that sometimes that happens with a coin flip, right? That it might flip 4 times the same way, even though it's a random thing. So I had heard that some people had some questions about if you have a relative, how far out on the family tree matters, right? So if you have a first degree relative, we just talked about how it's a 50-50 chance if a first degree relative has a BRCA or their gene mutation that you would share it. Well, with each branch out the family tree, that probability goes down. So for example, if I had a mom with BRCA1, my chance of sharing it is 50%. If I had a grandmother, my chance of sharing it is 25% because we share less and less of our genes with people with each branch of the family tree. So if you're getting out to multiple cousins, you don't share that many genes with them, and we worry a little less. But the way we think about testing is what we call cascade genetic testing, because we imagine it kind of cascading down like a river. And both Lauren and Michael talked about that once they were found to carry it, or once someone else in the family was found to carry it, the most important thing is to share that information and let the testing cascade happen. Right? So for example, you get tested, if your sibling or parent tests positive, then they're the next step on the cascade and their first degree relatives should test. If, like we heard about from Michael's story, his sisters tested negative, in many ways, that is the great sort of blessing of genetic testing to find out you got lucky. You did not get this. And moreover, as we heard, your children can't get it either. So the cascade can stop there. So that's kind of how we think about relatives and what to do.
That's all just such helpful information. And, when you're talking about that extended family tree, you're not totally out of the woods, but it's less of a percentage. So that's good. That's definitely good to know. Um, and so we advocate, for early screenings and being able to take control of your health. But we do know that there are, some cultures where, talking about these things, or even something as simple as like going to the doctor and talking about health related things is kind of taboo. So again, this being the holidays, times where we are more than likely going to be surrounded by family, do either of you have any advice about how to navigate what could be seen as tough conversations, but as Michael and Lauren's stories show, not really tough, not really as tough conversations, but can be for others.
I can talk to the fact that when I think about the blessing of knowing that I had the mutation motivated me to go to have, even without health problems, to go and have regular physicals every single year with a full blood workup. And I did get prostate cancer, but we would have never found it because my PSA score never went above 4. And so no doctor would have ever said, go further, Michael. But because my history with my nurse practitioner who cared and was aware that I had the BRCA and I had a 3.9 PSA 3 years in a row. I had my test and everything was clear and all that stuff, except for she got a feeling. And she called me a month or so after I went and had the discussion about how good my results were. And she said, I want you to just go and get a urological exam this year. You know, you're 51 years old, you have this consistent 3.9 PSA, and you have the BRCA mutation. So just go do it. And I did. I went and I found out then that I had prostate cancer. So I wouldn't have found out had I not known that I had the BRCA.
I just to add to that too, I think, you know, it's it when I first found out that I carried this, I'm not gonna lie, like it was frustrated and I was mad and like, why me? And then when my sister's results came through, it was a little bit like jealous, I guess I would say. Like, this isn't fair. Like, why me? But then, you know, as I've gone through everything and as I've realized that sharing my story and empowering other people to take control of their health, um, it 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 just gives me so much more hope that I can help somebody else. And I think that's the way I would approach a conversation when talking with family members. I'm grateful my sister doesn't have it because she has two little kids, and I don't want her to worry about, you know, my niece and nephew. So I think if you look at it as this is a horrible gift, but you're given it, and how can you turn it and make it better? Then you're helping somebody else, and that's like my mission in life now is to how can I help somebody else get through something as horrible as a diagnosis, let alone, you know, finding out you do carry a mutation that increases your risk. So.
And I would just say one of my favorite things about the work that I'm allowed to do is I get to work with people who honestly are usually coming in with incredibly selfless and loving sort of motives about their family, right? And so it's really hard to get this information at the time of a diagnosis of cancer. You're told you have cancer. Oh, and by the way, here's this other thing you have to deal with. And now it's your job to go talk to your family, right? A lot of people might say, forget it. You know, I have enough to deal with. I'm not going to worry about that. Don't bother me. You might imagine people saying that. But the truth is that people usually don't. People usually feel both a duty and an emotional connection to help their families. And I find it quite moving to see that people really are motivated to do that, even if they're in a tough time themselves and thinking about how can I turn my hard time into something that will help other people. So I find that very inspiring. And I think in terms of maybe how can you tell a relative, right? You're going to Thanksgiving, you maybe aren't thrilled to give this kind of news to the table of people. I think all you can do is your piece of it, which is to provide the information, right? You are not responsible, I think, for controlling what other people do about it. All you can do is tell people, and they may or may not choose to get tested themselves. They may or may not choose to get whatever treatment afterward, right? All you can do is give the information yourself. And I think, again, the other thing that comes up is sort of how do you how do you sort of phrase it? And I think it's that coming from a place of concern. So saying, I care for you, I feel responsible, as your relative, and I just want you to know about this. And I know this is hard, but I hope you can see it as something that we can use to protect ourselves. Again, that would be sort of what I would say. Now, I haven't lived through this as a relative the way Michael and Lauren have, but just in talking to many families over the years, that's kind of what I've heard from people as being successful sometimes.
I think to another important part about it is it has to be guilt free, not me trying to impose guilt on my father for passing it to me, and not me imposing guilt on myself for passing it to my son. I had no control over it. So putting it into the perspective that I have some blame or some kind of, um, I believe that the outreach is the obligation, not internalizing it as some kind of a, even to call it a mutation makes it seem like it's something bad, but maybe really is the miracle for our future family that we can help them know about that. Like I have to look at it that way because the cancer diagnosis in your own life, when someone says you have cancer, your life changes forever. And then you always have the opportunity to do the same thing. I'm a victim of cancer or I'm a survivor of cancer and I'm proactive in my health. I'm proactive in my outreach to people and in my own personal psychological healing that go along with just the cancer diagnosis. Then you add the BRCA and you could go down the rabbit hole. So don't. There's a lot of people like Dr. Kurian that are out there that want to help you and talk to you and look at you. No one wants to find out that they have it, but when you find out, it's sort of empowering rather than debilitating.
So I think that's a great point. And we always say, the estimate is when people have thought about this in genetics, the estimate is that each of us as human beings may have probably 5 or 6 gene changes. And I agree with you, mutation can sometimes feel like a harmful word, but genetic changes or genetic variants that might predispose us to have something happen, whether it be cancer or whether it be, tooth decay or whatever. I personally have terrible teeth, so that clearly is my problem. But, whatever it is, right? We all have, the estimate is kind of 5 or 6 things that could get us into trouble. And most of us don't know what they are. But you two know what one of them is already, and that is empowerment. So I always try to sort of frame it that way because it is true. It's not that somebody is different and worse or weird or a mutant or something like that, right? It is that we all have stuff, and learning what one of these things is in advance is being ahead of the game and being able to do something.
And Dr. Curry, and I like how you mentioned, that it's a selfless act, to do this, to take this on. I mean, personally, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer. Her mom was diagnosed with breast cancer. And so now that I work with Komen, I kind of take it upon myself to be like the keeper of health related things within the family. Just because like this knowledge is power. And I had no idea that my grandmother had breast cancer when she had it, but I later found out. And so making sure that even that you just have like this basic knowledge so that maybe not for me, but maybe for my cousin, maybe for somebody else, just so that we can have this information and know what to do with it and can make those decisions. But you have to have the information to be able to make those decisions, you know?
So I think that's so true. And the other thing I heard Michael say that I just wanted to comment on, because so many people feel it, and I think it's true, is this concern about people feeling guilt. And so sometimes people will say, well, I don't even want to tell my parents because I know they'll feel bad. They'll feel guilty, and I don't want them to feel guilty. I've seen young people who tested positive say that sometimes. And then I've heard people say, I can't tell my kids because I'll feel so bad and they'll feel bad and all of these things, right? And I think the more, exactly as Michael said, we can remember that we have no control over this. And undoubtedly, if we're parents, we passed on a lot of great things too, right? Because our kids are who they are and have many great qualities, and that this isn't anything we can control. I think it's important. I'm a parent myself, and I always joke that there are like 100 opportunities to feel guilty every day as a parent, and you just try not to take them all. So I'll speak about myself, but and so I think it's true as a relative as well that we didn't control this. Truly, we should try not to feel guilt about this. Easier said than done, but I think it's important to remember.
I agree. And um, as we're getting almost close to the end, Lauren, I know that you mentioned when you were speaking earlier that you had taken some additional steps to reduce your chances of getting other cancers. And so can you talk to us a little bit about those decisions and why you're like so passionate about educating as many people as you can about inherited gene mutations and genetic testing?
Yeah. Yeah. So I did have after I finished treatment and had a double mastectomy, because my risk for ovarian cancer, which is one of the cancers that you can get if you do carry this mutation, I ended up having a preventative hysterectomy. Ovarian cancer is harder to detect. So it was a choice I made. My surgeon had actually told me I could wait till I was 45. I ended up doing at the age of 39, because I don't think cancer knows your age. As there's um, you know, commonalities and themes that are seen, but I witnessed it myself. I wasn't 40 when I was diagnosed with breast cancer. I wasn't going to wait till I was 45 to see if I was going to get ovarian cancer. So it was purely a personal choice for me. And it was not something I was signing up for, that I was like, yay, I get to do this. But it gave me peace of mind that I wasn't going to be concerned that something was going to pop up later on. So I did do that. And then I am, like you said, I do a lot of advocacy work around genetic testing, as well as for women under the age of 40, because I was diagnosed under the age of 40. I have friends who are now also diagnosed under the age of 40 with breast cancer. And like I said, I don't think cancer knows your age. Otherwise, children wouldn't even get cancer. So I think it's really important to understand the risks, and that you're not invincible, and you can't control, just like, Michael and Dr. Curran have said, you cannot control this. And as much as you'd like to, um, it's just the cards you're dealt. And so how can you um, deal your cards in the best way that you can and control them? And as Michael said, he's a very healthy person. I am too. I was prior to as well. Eat right, and doing exercise, doing everything you can to prevent it. But that doesn't mean it's a surefire fire bet at that point. So it's just trying to remind people that taking care of yourself is important. That includes understanding if you have something that can increase your risk of getting cancer.
I want to say that I probably would have had my prostate removed at the doctor's office when he told me that I had prostate cancer, because I saw my sister's progressive disease over an 8-year period. And I recalled as a kid, my aunt, um, I couldn't imagine. So I got three possibilities: was radiation treatment, watch and wait, or the prostatectomy. Those were basically the three available treatments. I knew right away I was going to have it removed. I didn't want to have a radiated prostate in my body for the rest of my life. And the doctor made an interesting point, and that's why I started talking about the my treatment was because I was 51 when I got diagnosed. My oncologist, urologist, oncologist said, you tell me when you want to have the surgery, and no matter who's on my schedule, I'll try and fit you in because it's possibly more aggressive as a young man versus an 80-year-old man getting prostate cancer. Um, Watch and wait, I don't believe is a good method because when they find it again, or um, then usually it's really bad. It goes and it spreads to different places, and so for me personally, I had to get it out right away, and I did it. So I only knew I had cancer from September 22nd till December 22nd. And the only reason we waited till December 22nd was because the way the nerve clusters around the prostate are inflamed from the biopsy, they don't want that to be the case. They want them to settle down so they could preserve them. And so that was, and I've been cancer free ever since. 9 years this December 22nd. I'll be cancer free. I never took chemo. I never took a testosterone blocker. I never lost my hair. I never had anything except for recovery from prostate cancer, but that's not really a topic for this conversation. But I'd love to have that conversation too, because that was part of my healing was sharing that process with other families that just got diagnosed with prostate cancer. This was through USC, and I went every month with my wife, and we spoke about where we were and how it changed intimacy and how it changed our life for a lot of good ways. I mean, I hate to say it like that, but a lot of really miraculous things happened after I was diagnosed with prostate cancer.
I second that 100%. It changed your life. And I think my life is so much better now than it was pre-cancer, and the way you live is so much better. Um, the things you appreciate, the people you appreciate. Um, it's I'm just grateful. I'm so grateful to be alive. And I would never wish it upon anybody, but if this is the hand you are dealt, I tell people I promise you will be okay. And you will get through it, and life will be a lot different for the better. So
this is why I became an oncologist, seriously, is to spend time with people like this who, are able to see the experience, hard as it is, as something that they grow through and that leads them to help other people. So, of course, we have all have reasons for doing different things, but I was always just so moved to see what people make of this experience. And, it's sort of, you get lemons, you make lemonade. That is what we mostly see with human beings dealing with this. And it's quite moving and impressive. So thank you both.
And Dr. Kurian, it looks like we have a question. Somebody says, I have BRCA and I need to get my children tested. How do I go about this?
A great question. And so a few things would sort of depend on a few things. One thing would be how old are the children? Because usually we would say there is really no need for children to test when they are children. Typically, we see no reason why someone would need to be tested for BRCA1 or BRCA2 before the age of 18, and usually not, honestly, before the age of 25. Typically, if a young woman has a BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutation, we would start screening her for breast cancer around age 25. So often not a lot of reason to test before then. For a young man, you heard from Michael, typically we would start screening him for prostate cancer a little later, maybe 35, 40, depending on family history. So not a whole lot of reason for anyone super young to get tested. And we think that's important because this is a lot of information to carry. And if there's no medical reason that you need to know it when you're really young, we're not sure it's always great for a person to go ahead and get tested then. We think often it makes sense for someone to sort of wait till they're an adult, till maybe they're in college, after college, that kind of age, to pursue testing and find out, because it doesn't make a difference in their health before then. So I'll just put that piece of it out there. For children who are grown up, who are over 18, who are maybe in their early 20s, there are lots of ways people can get tested. Certainly through their own primary care doctor, they can meet with them. And typically what a primary care doctor would do might be to refer to a genetic counselor who might be able to sit down and talk with the person about, this is what we're looking for. Here are different options. We could test just for the same gene that your parent had, or we could test, like Michael said, for many different cancer genes, right? And there might be pros and cons to that. So often it's good to sit down and talk about it first. A genetic counselor might sit down and talk to someone and say, you're only 21. Maybe you don't need to know about this for another 4 years. Are you sure you feel ready? Or do you want to kind of wait and come back and think about it later? So that's the value of meeting with someone who can kind of talk through these things. And a person might be ready to test, but they might not. And so it can be a good way to do that in advance. And then the testing could go forward. So sometimes people might say, well, my child doesn't have a primary care doctor. How do we find a genetic counselor? There actually is a website of the National Society for Genetic Counselors, and it has a big button on there that says find a genetic counselor, and you can click it and they will find you someone in your area. So I just mentioned that as an option for people. Find a genetic counselor on National Society for Genetic Counselors, and they can help you do that. In terms of things like insurance coverage, nearly all insurances cover this if there is a relative who has it. So often people will say, well, what about would Medicaid cover it? Things like that. Truly, all insurances typically do if there is a genetic mutation in the family that a relative has. So typically gets covered. And that usually isn't a huge issue in terms of cost, is just what I would say.
Thank you for that information. I didn't know about some of that, so that was very helpful to know. Let's see. Don't think we have any more questions. So are there any final thoughts before we wrap up? This has been a great conversation.
I would say, even if you find out you do not have a cancer predisposition from your genetic testing, doesn't mean that you shouldn't still be proactive in your investigation of your life. Your body and how it works, and other family histories that are not genetically related, because cancer doesn't know your age, and it doesn't really care if you have a mutation. Just that mutation, again, is more information to help us to look for it rather than just to avoid it. But many people get cancer that don't have the BRCA. And just because you have the BRCA doesn't mean you'll ever get cancer.
I think Michael, you kind of touched on it a little bit, and I mean, I don't know the answer. But getting retested for genetic mutations, I think is something that you kind of touched on. It sounds like you've done it more than once. And I know I've been told I will need to do it regularly, but I guess Dr. Crane, I don't know what you typically suggest in terms of how often, because there are, to Michael's point, new mutations coming out all the time, it sounds like.
Great question. And so sometimes people will say, well, could it be wrong? Could the BRCA test I had years ago be wrong? That would be very unusual, just so people know, because sometimes people ask about that. So typically only a few labs do this test. They're generally very good and very careful. And so usually their practice is that they would draw your blood. The tube has a barcode on it that has to match the box. It's very, very careful so that there wouldn't be a sample mix-up. And if the labs find a mutation in the sample, they repeat the whole thing over again. So they really want to be sure, right? They don't want to make a mistake and tell people the wrong thing. So really, we don't see kind of false positives in that way. Do we ever see a false negative that somebody's gene got tested and they didn't find it? Usually not. And I say usually because our techniques of how we test get better over time. So for example, before 2007, we did a sequencing test that just read every letter, sort of, just one after another on the chain. And we didn't have a way to look for a bigger change in the gene where, for example, the whole thing might have gotten flipped around backwards. And so that was called a large rearrangement. We didn't know how to look for that before 2007. Now we do. So if you tested positive earlier, that's still true. But if you tested negative, maybe we missed it. So there are situations like that where sometimes if you had a negative test before, it might be worthwhile asking, going back to your doctor, your genetic counselor, and saying, hey, might something have been missed before? And the same is also true. Let's say you tested negative before, but we've discovered more genes. Maybe you should have a bigger panel test and see if we can find anything else. Or even if you do have BRCA2, but you have other cancers on the other side of the family that we haven't explained, maybe a bigger test. So those would be reasons.
I would comment just confirming what you were just saying, that the marker has like negative, positive, and then there's a third designation. And I don't want to say I don't think it says inconclusive, but it sort of has some kind of meaning of inconclusive that doesn't mean you don't have it or you do have it. It just means that the way they're testing now didn't show it now.
Exactly. It's called a
And
variant
genetic.
of uncertain significance, a VUS, and it's always annoying. And usually it's they've found a spelling that they don't quite understand. So I always joke that it's like how English people spell color COLOUR and American people spell it COLOR. And that's a different spelling, but it's not a misspelling, right? It gives you the same thing. But if you'd never seen an English person writing, you'd say, what is this? This is wrong. It's actually not wrong. It's just a little different, right? And so that's sort of what these things are. And it takes us time and assembling more data before we can make that call usually.
One more comment about genetic testing is that it's not limited to cancer only. Just recently, luckily for Michael, I had a high ferritin content in my blood, which means that my liver stores iron. And that is an indicator that I could have something called hemochromatosis. Well, it sounds really, really, really bad, but it's not really, really that bad. But they did a genetic test, and Michael's genetic predisposition is I have a mutation that is only 1% of the total universe of people. And there's another mutation for hemochromatosis that's very common, but I happen to have the one that's unique and rare. And it doesn't mean I'm going to get hemochromatosis, but it, again, another factoid of information that I have. I'm meeting with a hematologist on Monday to find out if I have the hemochromatosis and what do I have to do to keep myself healthy uh, it's traditional bloodletting is the um, remedy. So it fits in with my philosophy of never taking a medicine if I don't have to.
Thank you for that. And I just want to thank you all again for y'all's time today. This was a great conversation, and thank everybody who is joining us online. Um, Definitely want to thank our sponsors, thank Komen, thank Johnson and Johnson for continuing these education on these important topics to help, empower us to take charge of our health. And to learn more about inherited gene mutations and genetic counseling and testing, you can visit komen.org or brcainmen.com. Again, I want to thank you, Michael, Dr. Kurian, and Lauren for this conversation, and I hope you all enjoy your holidays.